Hello, Joanna. A huge welcome
Hello.
back.
Thank you. Thank you for having me back. What a treat.
Well, it's been delightful just having even the internal conversation with myself about what can we dive into today,
Mm.
and knowing there's like this just like vast expanse that where we could journey together, and we have got rather a juicy topic today, haven't we?
We do.
Mm. And so I'll recap how it was kind of being shown to me this morning, because I think it's a good place to start. And I think it's maybe not always asked in quite such a clear way, but I think in some ways anyone who is journeying from perhaps that kind of more daylight world of what we might call
Mhm.
like self-help, personal development,
Mhm.
um personal growth, that is like sort of happening, and I've been more of like a sort of
Mhm.
daylit world. And then as we start to go deeper, we might well ask the question I'm about to uh rephrase, that a client asked me earlier, which is like, what's the difference between that kind of growth where we have this sense which is
Mhm.
quite external, certainly derived, almost like there's somewhere we ought to be, there's somewhere we ought to
Mhm.
get to, and then as we start to, however we might name it, but a much more kind of soulful descent, like
Mhm.
journey into the darkness, as we spoke to
Mhm.
last time. What's the difference? Like, that still feels like there's some growth, there's a capacity for growth, but it's different. And that was the question one of our clients asked me today. And we were exploring it through the lens of Telos, and this idea that the
Mhm.
we are growing, but we're growing into ourselves, like the
Mhm.
archetypal kind of acorn into the oak,
Mhm.
and how that by its very nature suggests all of this was needed to, for the acorn to be a certain shape,
Mhm.
size, type of acorn to grow into that certain type of oak. And so that's what we're going to be exploring today, and I'd love your sense on that before we journey. Like, how would you name what we're talking about here?
Well, it's such a rich topic, and there's like I know as you're speaking, I was like writing down like scurrying across the page of different thoughts that I have. It's a really good distinguishing, and I think in some capacity, let's call it like the true growth, um, versus that kind of like that idealized bettering that is so, and like the first line I would want to draw in that is it's like that idealized bettering of I'm going to be better, or I'm going to find that version of myself that's like the right version. It's all external, right? It's all measured off what society is conditioning you to think is that right role, right? And I think
Mm.
in that comes that narrative, oh, it should be comfort and better. And I always joke with my clients that the image that I have for this is kind of like that like 90s makeover movie, where it's kind of like, oh, I'm having this struggle, and then this like
Mm.
musical montage comes on, and then they like get great in like 4 scenes.
Yeah.
And it's like,
Always
where's that?
lose the
Right.
glasses.
Yeah,
Like
like totally. And then I'm the new person. Suddenly I'm not the nerd. I'm the new, cool person because I took my glasses off. But it's that external thing, right? And
Mm.
first verse this true growth, which doesn't have it's in the sense that we're not going to know what the agenda of that true growth is,
Mm.
right? It's going to present itself. And can you be with whatever wants to present itself through you in your life, which might not be the thing that you wanted or thought or looked the way you wanted it to be? One of the images that has always really stuck for me is this kind of notion of us all coming into the world as these kind of like golden balls of our true selves, right? But that golden ball comes into a world that is immediately conditioned by the zeitgeist it came into, the family complex it stepped into, the gender it was born into, like all of it, right? And immediately that golden ball gets caked and coated, right? And those cakes and coated get layers and layers and layers, and we lose more and more access to the clarity of that golden ball, right? Which is
Mm.
that message of that true self. And so growth, in my opinion, is actually about subtraction, not about addition. It is about going out and
Mm.
taking off those layers, which is a deepening, so that that which is already there can present itself to you. Right. So it's almost like growth is the wrong word, right? Because it has that kind of like upward additional energy where really it's kind of a subtraction in.
Yeah, thinking of it through the lens of the sort of acorn to oak archetype. The challenge, I think, for certainly those of us in this modern culture, it's like, in order for the acorn to actually grow into the oak, there needs to be the kind of removing of everything around, like to come back to the acorn first.
Yeah.
It's like the acorn can grow into the oak, but only when we're starting with the acorn, not all these layers of conditioning around it that are saying, no,
Yeah,
this
it's
shape,
like
look
that.
like this.
Yeah, it's like that acorn is never going to is never going to grow into a giraffe. It can't, right?
Yes.
So when the pressure within is, how do I make this, a pear tree or a giraffe or whatever it is, it never works, right? And so, yeah, we do have to kind of strip into what is true to us. And that's the question. That's the hard thing to discern. What is true to you?
Yes. Yes, it's like that cliched kind of like, just be yourself. And actually, that's possibly the most challenging thing of all.
Absolutely, to discern what that is, right? And I think too, one of the things that I think about a lot with that is that I think that work is actually incredibly subtle in a certain way of kind of what really is you, and what is the art of, sometimes we have to take things that have been given to us, layers on that golden ball, the outer elements of that acorn, and kind of shed them, and they actually might be true to us, right? But we need to somehow come into them in our own way. We have to crumble the foundation and then rebuild it. And maybe we think, yeah, that idea, say like having a child, that's a great example of that. Is that true for you to do that in your life, to have that archetype come through you in that form? I mean, it's an enormously pressured and conditioned idea. So dismantle it. But if it's right for you, remantle it in the way that is yours.
Yes. Yes. Really great example. So we were joking just before we started recording. You were saying, when you go to your therapist, it's like, here's episode 732 of the same material. And what I love about that, and it's not dissimilar to what I was sharing with you, this huge realization I had at lunchtime about something so obvious that I've looked at through so many lenses over the last, say, 10 years, and then suddenly saw the meaning or the nature of my childhood in a way that just kind of almost shifts it entirely. And I've just suddenly seen it from this other angle. And I think there's something important in that, the way that often we will have whatever those layers are around there's two separate things that just come in at once. So one, we likely, every time we think we're done and we're there and we've got the golden ball or we've got the acorn, likely we're ready to just see the next layer down of that.
Yes.
Just like, here I am again, I thought I dealt with this. And then there's also, and this I think is lends itself really well to kind of picking up the thread from our last conversation, that if we think again of that golden ball and how it gets sort of layered with all this stuff that's not us, but the very nature of the not us, the very nature of the wounds, of the conditioning, is also of us. It's almost like
for us.
It's like that's part of it. It's like the shape of the golden ball or the shape of the acorn called in a certain type, and what gathered around it is also for us, is also of us, but just in a different way to the kind of like the deeper heart of us. And I think that's the more we sort of journey with this kind of orientation, like all of this is the way, all of this it's like not in the way of me becoming my best self, but it's like it is the way. I think the more and more we have the capacity to see all those experiences, the darkness, the
Mhm,
wounding, as you say, being for us, and then it almost allows us to see that even more. Like I say, the experience I had this morning was like, oh my goodness, of course I was meant to have
mhm,
these childhood experiences. It couldn't have been another way,
mhm,
actually.
mhm.
um and so this is a very long-winded way round to say, I'd love your thoughts on that. This idea that these aren't just random happenings, but these are the exact happenings, the exact
Yeah.
material that was needed.
Well, there's so many words that I think in our kind of Western scientific mind, we're a little skittish to use around this idea, like destiny, fate, telos, this idea that, are you individually creating your life through your own self-determined will, or are you not?
Mm,
Is something larger holding it? And one of the things that I, as a Jungian, really value about Jung's work is I think he is really wrestling with this question in a lot of ways,
mm,
and really trying to find a pathway in for the rational scientific Western mind to entertain this question, which is,
mm,
is there a larger directive source in life and in psyche that is weaving a final destination, right? This would be telos for you, that is ultimately to your own developmental good, your own true, this is individuation, right? Becoming your true deep self. And for in the Jungian opus, the the word to describe this presence is self, right, with a capital S, which is Jung's word for God, right, of the greater organizing principle. And the self is not moral, right? It's not moral in the way that we as a society put morality onto things. And so I think
mm,
this is one of the stumbles that happens in this question, is this thing has happened to me and it was bad because it hurt me, it was painful, it was destructive. And so we get stuck there.
mm,
Right? I've been made uncomfortable, and something that was stable and known in me has now lost its footing, and this is bad. Where from the perspective of that larger growth, that obstacle that is put in front of you might be exactly what you need at that moment to push you towards something in yourself that will unravel and become more in alignment with what wants to live itself through you. And that becomes a really tricky question, right? I actually think Eastern philosophy and traditions are much better at this, more
mm.
honest to this idea. Like
Yes.
in the Vedic
Mm,
tradition, they have the idea of the nine Antarya, which is, your concept of these series of obstacles that are gonna, be put in front of you throughout life. But these obstacles are not the obstacles, they are the path themselves.
mm.
Right. And
Yes.
I think like the Gita speaks to this as well, right? Of, when Krishna is talking about devotion and action, he's like, everything you do, everything that happens to you needs to be an expression of the divine, seen that way.
Mm,
Right. And so here we are trying to kind of calculate what is right or what is wrong for something, when really how do we hold this as, this is a question that Jung used to ask his clients that I think is really important. He would say to the self-reflective question is, who am I to have this happen to me?
mm,
Like, why is this the necessary thing? What if you see this obstacle, this experience, this tragedy, not necessarily as in the kind of confines of the moral right and wrong, but as the necessary seed, right, of something, or maybe fertilizer would be a better word, that is
mm.
going to kind of
Yes.
incubate something in you. If that is a lens that held, it changes the way we look at ourselves enormously, and it definitely changes the way we ask that for first question, which is like, what is my capacity for true growth, and what is a part of that?
Mm. Yes. There's I had about 50 different things just all come in at once, including the dog trying to get through the door, which I might need to try and let him in a sec. Um,
Like,
um,
this is an important conversation, I want to be
yeah.
part of it.
um, bringing in Eastern philosophies, I think you're right. There is, you know, within our modern culture, even through the lens of work like Jung's, where there is a much more in order for that even to make sense, there needs to be some capacity for the spiritual, for the soulful, for even that to be a worthwhile path. And yet, again, there was certainly I guess Jung's desire is that it would be something accessible for people who aren't necessarily kind of like, you know, fully ready to embrace that. So there is a kind of, even like using the word self in the way that he did, is clearly, you know, trying to like, you know, push God a little bit out of the main conversation.
Absolutely.
And I don't know if you're familiar with the book The Sound of Bells. It's a kind of comparison of Jung's kind of concept of consciousness and Meher Baba's. And there's a really interesting table where it's kind of showing the progression of Jung's work of individuation. And then Meher Baba's sort of part of the table only starts at the point where Jung's ends. I mean, if there's overlap, it's like one row on a table. In that, in order to even be in that conscious, you know, God realization, the work of individuation has to happen first. And then it's a kind of like it can continue. But there was something, seeing it in black and white on a table like that, there's like a real like, this is so interesting, because I mean, I don't mean this is about Jung himself, because I think he saw all of that actually himself anyway. But in terms of the more public expression of that, because it was happening through this lens that wasn't necessarily naming that that union with God as the ultimate kind of outcome, it changes the conversation. It changes how we orientate around the work. And that was just, I'm going to let the dog in because he really wants to be part of this conversation. But that was, I think there's something really important about that, because that in itself changes the lens through which we look at all of this,
100%.
including the material. Right. Continue talking. I'm going to let the dog in.
You know, I think that's very spot on. And, you know, I think in a lot of ways, like the Jungian project is about purification. And in some ways we could argue, as are all the, you know, kind of like Eastern religions and traditions and practices, really, you know, about kind of how do you come into enough self-knowledge, right, through removing the conditioning of what has been placed on you to discern what is indigenous to your being, right? And when that process can be embarked upon, you know, the tangle of your own experience and density of your own experience starts getting loosened, right? And through that loosening, the self, the golden ball, or maybe we should call it the golden onion, because that's really what it's more like, right? Starts to show itself. And you're not creating that, right? You're not creating your dream. You're not creating the things that happen to you in your life that are offerings or to your own process, but you have to kind of open up. You have to purify enough, come into your own awareness about yourself, right? And Jung's system is really good at that, you know, of kind of cultivating your own awareness of the inner dynamics and the inner worlds and how you respond to things, so that I think ultimately all of that can be let go of and you can just connect to source. And in that way, I think there is a lot of truth to what you're saying.
So that's really what's occurring to me, is that this, even the conversation we're in around this idea of fate, the soul, God, I think that there's a couple of things that are coming to mind. Firstly, that the orientation to see all of these things that happen to us as, you know, part of that flow of our own expression of God, let's say. That's that requires a worldview that just isn't our modern worldview in the first place. But then even as we start to perhaps open to that worldview, because of everything we're talking about, there's a kind of catch-22 in that it's even our idea that that is what's happening is ultimately going to be a fantasy with a ph, you know, a kind of, it's not actually going to be what it is, but we're going to have our own idea of that that at least allows us to continue the journey. But it in a way is also then going to be potentially what yeah, I feel like I'm kind of going down so many levels now, may not be very helpful, but in short, that's what I was appreciating. It's kind of like an honesty with which like all of this is going to be happening through the lens of our own wounding and conditioning, including the notion that this is all for us.
Yeah.
And there's a kind of like honesty of holding that paradox, I think, as we journey.
Yeah, I mean, of course, right? It's like we are in our own illusion of self always, right? And I think the mistake is not realizing that it isn't self-generated, right? That it's okay that, you know, yeah, you're in this incarnation and you have your own conditioning and you have your own experiences and you're looking at the world through a certain way, and it's like, don't miss the point, right? That reality is yours. And that's where people get stuck, right? They get stuck holding on to things in themselves that don't serve them anymore. Right? Thinking, oh, I need this, I have to have this, this is my idea, this is my fantasy, and we literalize it, right? And then it gets rigid and concrete and we get stuck. And, you know, I think it's more that perspective of, you know, this is kind of to that question, who am I to have this happen to me? It's like, it's about a loosening, right? And opening up of, rather than like, this is mine and this is like, I am this and this is my identity and I identify with this wound, this pain, I'm cleaved to it. Right? It's like, or that's just your own fantasy and your own projections onto things. And what if there becomes more loosening or space, right? There's a beautiful, in alchemy, like one of the main alchemical stories, right, is about the old king who, you know, lives in his castle as an old man and his land is dry and barren and the crops no longer grow. And one day, you know, in his own kind of decrepitude, the old king leaves his castle and goes out and sees his barren land, and he begins to weep. And he weeps and he weeps and he weeps, and his tears start flooding the land and rising and rising and rising, and eventually the tears drown him. And in his own drowning, he is reborn and he leaves the field as a young man. And, you know, that story, right, is about the rigid, cleaving, dried up ideas in us that we become so identified with. I am this pain, I am this complex, I am this story. And the egoic holding of that, right, calcifies us. And something has to be opened and let go and, you know, maybe cried about, grieved, watered with life, for there to be this kind of renewal in self. And that's part of the process, is just that constant washing in a certain way of us.
Yeah. What was just occurring to me is how there's I think part of orientating around ourselves and our world is learning that language of symbols, like how what symbols are occurring, what they're pointing to. And then through what you were just saying, I was like, this is ultimately like honoring that symbol. This is the symbol. It has meaning, it has purpose, it's being shown to me right now for a reason. But then also allowing that symbol to kind of like crumble, dissolve. But then a bit like kind of the Russian dolls, there's another symbol that kind of arises that is, you know, of the same nature as the original symbol. Bit similar to what I was saying to you earlier. It's like I suddenly saw my childhood dynamics, which I've looked at in all
Mhm.
kinds of like therapy and shamanic work for years. And all of a sudden, it's the same symbol, but I saw something different in that same symbol, which
Yeah.
changes everything. It changes who I
Yeah.
am in relationship to it. It changes
Yeah.
kind of what that means for me.
Yeah.
And I think just even for us, you know, again, in our modern culture, like learning the language of symbols is already a challenge. But it's then, like you say, like recognizing like we grip too hard to
Mhm.
those symbols that we've seen at a certain point in our journey stops us from seeing kind of like, what does it mean now, here?
Yeah, and it makes me think of just the idea of like tension. This is a really hallmark idea in the Jungian kind of way of working with self, is like holding tension in this
Mm,
in self, and the idea that from tension something new does emerge. And
mm,
we're so bad at holding tension in our culture, right? It kind of
mm,
goes to what we were talking about a lot in our first conversation, of this like need to know, this need to kind of function and have control of, and like understand, right? So we pick things. We're like, okay, this is my understanding of this part of myself.
mm,
This is, and hold on to it with such a fervor. And there's so little ability to kind of hold the opposing side, which might be, let's just say, you don't know at all.
mm,
Can you hold those two things together? Like hold the process of your own practice of discerning and knowing and unraveling, mixed with the other side, which is actually you really don't know what a thing is and you probably never will fully. And
mm,
from the uncomfortable tension that will come from that, when it is ready, something emerges, right? A third comes out of that,
mm,
and we want, in our directed functioning world, right? We want that to happen on a timeline, and we want to happen it quickly, right? It's almost like we like put the pie in the oven, and then with our own like kind of crazy willfulness, we're like, it's gonna cook, it's gonna cook. It's like, no, the pie's gonna be done when it's done,
mm.
right? When its own process of cooking and heat and all the ingredients together interact and bake itself in its own way. And that moment that you're speaking about, right? That's when something that you've been working on for a lifetime shows itself in a different way. Did you do that? It's an interesting question, right? Because it's like, no, but you did prepare the soil by doing the work. And then when something new is
Mm.
supposed to be there, ding, the pie's done.
Yes, I love this so much. And the interesting thing is, I think we have like that's happening at a macro level, like across our whole
Mhm.
lifetime. And then we have um that shows up like it's sometimes, you know, we might have a period where it's like happening a lot, and then other times it might, you know, the pie requires longer in the oven. But I
Mhm.
had such a perfect example of this happen earlier. Like I've just realized, just before I had the realization that I had, I was leaving my therapist a message, and I was saying to him something along the lines of, I feel like I'm being called into like a place of alchemy at the moment, but I don't yet know what it is. I could just feel this
Mm.
sort of like this exact what you're talking about. I could feel the tension. I could feel that kind
Mhm.
of pregnant pause that
Mm.
something was about to be revealed. And I was just like, I can feel it, but I don't know what it is. And I think it was like 10 minutes later, I had the realization, but I wasn't even looking for it. I just happened to reread a message, and then it was just,
Yeah.
mm,
Yeah, which is, I mean, that's the perfect example, right? And you can kind of, in that, like, I'm imagining the ways you would stop that process, right? Which is like, oh, I'm feeling some kind of, you know, you said it really beautifully, a pregnant pause in something. Oh, let me just like try to figure out what that is. Let me get busy. Let me overthink this. It's like these are the things that that arrest that kind of natural flow,
mm,
right? Where we need to discern, and we need to know, and we get busy, and we get, overly cognitive, and we lose the mystery in a certain way, right? We lose the ability to let something that is more subtle, that is not probably going to burst itself through that door. Well, let's say it will at some point, but let's hope that we don't resist it to the point that that
mm,
happens, right? And just miss something. We're just,
Yes.
and how do we create that attunement, right, to the true growth, to our original question, right, to what wants to show itself to you in your life, what wants to be grown through you in your life, and how do we kind of find our own ways of listening to that?
Yes. That finding our own ways to listen to that feels in such stark contrast, going back again to what we were saying in our last episode, how culturally there is this persistent drive towards kind of like, again, I need to find the answer, I need to fix this so I can continue to function.
Mm-hmm.
And so the orientation will be whatever allows us to function is the thing to do. And often what we're talking about here, it's very counterintuitive in that it's likely going to be not that. It's not going to be looking for the answer in that kind of way, and certainly not through the lens of like, okay, if I can just solve this, I can get on with things. There is just a whole different orientation.
Yeah, and that goes so against the grain of, the kind of modern hum of life. And, you know, and and it makes me think of kind of what, you know, obviously, like, as a Jungian, like I think of, like Jungian psychology is a Western phenomenon. It's addressed to deal with the problems of Western modernity's impact on the individual. And in a lot of ways, it's important to see this kind of, at least this is how I hold it, is that, the kind of Jungian opus and this idea of how do we kind of come into enough awareness of ourself to get to the point where we could let self show itself to us in our lives, and really let that lead and not the ego, right? The entire project. It's like, this is a very ancient knowing. Jung is not coming up with this, like, at all, right? He's translating this ancient wisdom that he spent his entire life trying to discern in himself and in, all the readings he did, and his interest in, mysticism and Eastern traditions and ancient cultures. I mean, all of this into this funnel that the Western mind might be able to walk down, right? Because you and I, right, we come from that conditioning is on top of our golden ball. So we have to work at, if it's like you want to see the world completely animistic, that becomes something that you and I from a Western Cartesian world have to work on. We don't come from a culture that just, that is true, right? And so he's finding this kind of pathway back into that knowing. And I think so, I think our kind of, to bring in your thoughts of like this functioning egoic world, it's like, it kind of starts at the beginning, and it's like, okay, here I go. Hopefully I can go through the mill enough to let some of that go, so that I might be able to kind of come out of it with the realization that I'm not actually in charge of my life at all. That I am like, the ego is a tiny ship on the great ocean, and I have to learn how to surrender to what that truer, greater, deeper, larger self wants of me.
What's just come to mind, which is probably a whole tangent in itself, but I'm going to trust that the unconscious is doing its thing by presenting it now. So,
of course,
I recently read a great book by Liz Green. I can't remember the title. It's something like Jung and Astrology, or something like that. Really dense book. Are you familiar with it?
I mean, I'm familiar with her work, so that sounds like the right title for her.
And it was quite a it's almost like Jung's history with astrology, in terms of like following the kind of path of through his life, the evidence there is in terms of his understanding of astrology, how he used astrology both for himself and with his clients. And this goes right to the heart of the conversation we're in about these notions of kind of like what's fated versus kind of like what's unfolding for us. What does all this mean? It's like through that lens that's like almost like the archetype of astrology, it has that right baked in, which
Absolutely.
what I understand you know, Jung wasn't avoiding, like, you know, you engage with astrology, it brings you face to face with those ideas.
Yeah.
And so again, I'm not even going to pretend I know why that just came to my mind, but it just did. So I'm not even going to ask you a question. I just want to kind of like hand that over to you and see if you've got anything to say about it.
Well, no, it's really spot on. And one of the things that I personally like about astrology is I think it relativizes this kind of the pace of that kind of if functioning egoic agenda in us. Because if you look at your chart, say for example, right, and you're like, oh, I feel really lost, and I'm, things kind of feel like they're unraveling, and I'm kind of cast out at sea, and I really would like that to get better right now. And you look at your chart and it's like, well, actually Neptune's going to be transiting you for the next 6 years. So so
Good luck with that.
so that shoreline moment that you want, that is, I'm like, it's all come together and I finally get to get up and I get to kind of like march on the firm ground. It's like, yeah, well, this process needs to happen to you for 6 more years before something else gets to unfold. And it slows us down, right, in a certain way and asks a lot of surrender. So, what if your entire life is aspected by a certain energy or a certain astrological force that is pushing something specific into your life? And you could say, well, I really need to get rid of the Saturn vibe that's like in my life, it's terrible, and like, no thank you. It's like, well, you know what, maybe that's like Saturn's in your birth, your birth house, and your sun is aspected by it, and it's like, that's the deal. Right. So it invites the surrender that we're talking about to the larger kind of orchestration of your life. And I think, held in a certain way, and I think Jung really tried to do this, you can kind of look at astrology as like a map of the soul in a certain way, right? Of like, what are the obstacles, what are the challenges, what are the currents of my life that are being put into place, that was put into place long before I decided I didn't want that or wanted to go here or anything. It's just the larger map. And can you surrender to being in it?
Yeah. Firstly, I admire how well you did with that, me just throwing that over at you.
No, I love it.
No, I love that so much. And I think there's a difference here. And I think this is in some ways the $1 million question, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. There's like a humility and a kind of surrendering that can come with relating, and we just happen to be talking about astrology here. We could be using anything else, but like just talking about specifically astrology, where we recognize there is this bigger flow of life that's happening, flow of time, flow of events, flow of archetypes that we are an expression of, and kind of can be in alignment with and conscious of. Or we can relate to it from an orientation of like, oh my goodness, I'm a victim to this.
Totally.
It's written in the stars. I've got just no hope, because it's already like decreed that it's going to happen. So I'd love your thoughts on, because I don't think we have a particularly again, culturally, a particularly conscious relationship with these ideas. So this in itself is quite a challenge, isn't it, to orient in a way that's actually I was about to say functional, but I don't mean functional in the way that we've been talking about functioning.
It's very lost in our culture in a certain way, of thinking about kind of the modern condition in a certain way, right? We've, the kind of individualized modern individual, right, comes out of this long-standing history of ritual and tradition and lineage that explained our world and our place in it, right, and guided these questions. But the modern mind is so divorced from that alive tradition that now the task of knowing oneself and answering the great questions of life are up to the individual alone, right? Which is a weight that our psyches is not capable or accustomed to bearing, right? And so when we kind of create this split, so to speak, between this the flow of all things, the unconscious, source, self, God, whatever you want to call it, right? And kind of put that task of knowing and discerning and guiding our lives onto our own individual psyches alone as individuals, the weight is enormous and people cannot hold it. Right? It's like, this is what comes from that victim, and the victim comes from that. Like, this is too much. I can't hold this. Right? Why is this happening to me? How do I understand this? Rather than, the more honest image, which is like, there is a great river that flows through all things. And your little life is you coming to it and dipping your little cup in that river and like looking at that little, but that river's still flowing. And we used to really know this. And that held us, and it held the process, and it held the misfortunes and the challenges of life in the current of something that was greater, and the tapestry of something that was greater. And we knew we had rituals and lineages and songs, right? Dances, deities to kind of help us connect into the truth of that, so that we could take our individual life thread and be held into something longer. And that is innately deeply soothing and deeply connecting. But now it's us, right? Alone against this kind of, disconnected cosmos that, has no meaning and has no, purpose. And so we are victims of that, right? And I think that sets up a psyche that is really overwhelmed at core. Right. And maybe, maybe this is a thought I'm just having. Maybe it's also like that functioning that we prioritize comes from how overwhelmed we are. And we're just like, here's my little oar. Like, I got to have this because I can't make meaning out of the greatness of life. And we used to not have to, because we believed in something larger.
Yes, there's the paradox, the greater paradox that we're talking about here, I don't think is especially easy for humans to hold, but we had things that helped us hold it that now we lack.
And so here it's up to us individually to create that meaning. And and to bring in Jung again, right? Like, Jung is a response to that, right? He's trying to get individuals to find individual connection to their inner world through the dream, right? To somehow get that individual mind in relationship to the idea that there is a greater story for your life out there, right? And that fated, teleological, destined, whatever word you want to use to describe that piece is I think in some ways very medicinal for people to be like, you know what? Yeah, this is as it should be, because it is what is happening to me. Right. And whether it's good or bad, whether it's uncomfortable, it's an obstacle, or it's a positive thing, like I'm thinking about, in the great spiritual texts, it's like, I'm thinking about the Gita, and there's some chapter in it, and apologize for not knowing, but it's like, where Arjuna is asking Krishna, what do you, tell me like about your form, tell me who you are. And Krishna goes into this like beautiful summary of just, he's like, this is just a small amount of what I am that you can maybe hold, because you're, and, and just goes into everything, like, like I'm the wind, I'm, like I'm love, I'm death, I'm this, I'm it all. And so how can you start considering the things that come into your life as offerings from something larger to give you what is to help open the door into what is true for you to manifest in this life? And if you see everything as a manifestation of that source, even if it's hard, if death of somebody that you love, an injury that's happened, an illness, it's like it changes the way that you hold it. And you can enter into what you were saying kind of when we started this last thought of like into that surrender and humility.
Yes, it's interesting that you'd just then gave the example of an injury. I can't remember if I mentioned last time we spoke, but I broke my foot a couple of weeks ago, and it's been an interesting experience at two levels. One, for me personally, to really orientate around that and kind of everything that's come from it in the way that we're talking about, but then also something that a kind of more, and also looking at a kind of like, I guess, a more macro or meta level, where it's just like, you know, the way that is ultimately what's happening for all of us all the time, whether we recognize that or not.
Mm.
And then I was also thinking how we can, because again, we aren't held in a kind of tradition and cosmology where this has place,
Mhm.
how we can sometimes flip to a kind of another end of the pole where it becomes almost like delusional, where we're seeing symbols or engaging with symbols in a way that's I suppose leaning into it in a way that isn't kind of recognizing the symbols as symbols, but looking at them perhaps in a more literal way. I'm not even naming
Mm.
that quite well, but as in, so from a kind of disconnected kind of modern lens, I've just broken my foot, and it's painful and inconvenient and has led to, you know, me not being able to do things I'd normally do. From the lens that we're talking about, this has been a really rich crucible for alchemy. It's
Mhm.
created experiences that wouldn't have happened another way, and a
Mm.
way, and they couldn't have happened another way because they've happened in this way.
Mhm.
Um, and then there's this other thing that I was recognizing where there is perhaps a like grasp, like that can almost become a mechanism in itself, where it's like we're almost like latching on to like, oh, this has to have real meaning, and this means this about me, but in a kind of like way that's perhaps like inflated or grandiose, that also isn't
Mm.
serving. Does that make sense? I haven't named that
Yeah.
particularly clearly, but I'd love to know your thoughts on that.
Well, what I hear in it is where that kind of like symbolic living and that symbolic perspective starts actually getting commandeered by that kind of like functioning knowing agenda, right?
Mm,
Which it's like, and maybe a good way to look at it is it's like, can it be held loosely or is it being gripped?
yes, yes.
Right. And
Mm,
it's like that we need to now know what that is. And you need to tell, like, I need to go and so say, like, let's take your foot, right? It's like, what do foot symbolize, right? And it's like you can hold, you know, a lot will come up, right? It's like, you know, your connection to the ground, your kind of ensouled connection to earth, to how you walk through life, right? Feet are also about balance. They're also, you know, a very religious in a certain kind of motif, or at least a certain kind of, yeah, I would say kind of an image of kind of the barefoot versus the enclosed foot. You know, it's like about vulnerability and openness, and it's like, right, you can go, you can go, you can go, right? And once those things start getting literalized or calcified and saying, oh well, it's actually, it was this, it was my need for
mm,
balance, it was, you know, I need more balance in my life and I'm not doing that enough, and now you've literalized it and you've held it, you know, and
mm,
and that loses the water of the symbol, it loses its own nature. You know, as a Jungian, which this can be a very controversial thing in the Jungian community, is like, I'm actually a really big fan of James Hellman, and some, I don't know if you're familiar with Hellman's
mm.
work at all, but some people, like, you know, a
There's
lot
a
of the
split.
Jungians are real about Hellman, but what I value so much about Hillman is he, you know, which you have to almost like even deliteralize Hillman to start
Mm,
appreciating his work, but he's saying, hey, you know, we have an idea about what a thing is. And if you hold on to that idea too hard and grip it too firmly, you lose its nature. So let's not do that,
mm,
right? we have to both hold the meaning making desire to say, I want to look at this foot, breaking my foot in a symbolic way so that I can get into something that is beyond the kind of like literal and reductive. But also I need to always keep in mind that I don't actually know what it is, and how do I open this and hold it with curiosity, which I would argue in some ways is the most important attitude, rather than I know. And now, now this is about balance and this happened to me for balance. It's like, you don't know. How do you let more in? How can you hold that quest loosely? And it's very hard. I mean, I don't ultimately have the answer for that, but I think that is the practice.
Yes. I love what you've said there. So, using this as the example, because I think there's a lot in this as the example here, that when it first happened, I was kind of like, okay, this is interesting. This is what's being provided to me. And sort of started a kind of, I guess, fairly natural, like, what could this mean? Like the type of symbols that you're talking about. And then the fact it's a right foot, which can be considered the masculine. So kind of went on. And then I had a sense of, this doesn't feel like the avenue. Like this it's not even necessarily what I'm doing is wrong. It just this isn't what this is about. I don't know what it's about, but it's not this. And it's just like, what I'm being asked to do right now is just to give this space and to see what this is for. And so it was quite a conscious realization that I was starting to go down that kind of like graph, like what's the point of all this? Why am I experiencing this? So like, actually, I don't know yet, and that's okay.
And that's okay, right? It's like you can notice that moment, right, where that kind of that egoic identity steps in and says, I need to know what this is, right? And what I think is really important, that part of what you're saying right now is like, we do always need to be curious and open and digging into ourselves. Right? It's not like what we're talking about isn't just hands off the wheel surrender. That's like, we'll just see what presents itself always to me. That's not the point either, right? It's like, we have to get into our lives and we have to work and get curious and be open and pay attention, and always keeping in mind largely that you don't actually really know. And maybe there's some, if held in that way, at least for me, there's actually some relief in that. And this to me, this is a little bit of a side tangent, but like for me, this really shows itself in language, like the challenge of language for me around, like I speak professionally for a living, with my clients, and everybody, we're always trying to describe and talk about things and, learn more, but always wanting, and for me, always really concerned with the calcification of language, right? This is my mother complex. It's like, is it? I don't know, and we don't really know what that means. And now you've you've identified yourself as this, and now you're holding on to it, and it gets really tricky, right? To kind of find the way to have the process, to kind of have the funnel, so that we can take what is so ineffable and so great into some way that we can speak about it and talk about it and share it and sing about it and whatever it is. But then also, like, the reduction that happens in that funnel is like always feels like a tragedy to me. And I don't really know, it's a bind that I don't know how to fully overcome, because I'm afraid of what you're saying, right? Which is that like rigid holding of, and the limiting that happens, right? Like we could say with your foot, like, the right foot is considered more masculine, and the foot forward in the world would be a father image, right? As you go out into the trajectory of the world. So this is what gives you the insight into your father. Done. That's a nice clean bow. We're done. But we've killed something in doing that. Right? And we've made a path of knowing that we've proved out and said is true, that we don't actually know that those two things are what is.
Yes.
And so how do we hope? Maybe
I was just thinking, the irony is the realization I had earlier was actually about my father. But
well, totally. That's what I'm saying. It's like you can make those two things, and then you can take your kind of proud knowing and say, I figured it out, and those two things were connected, and I had to break my foot to break the old understanding of the father for me to see the new one. And it's like there's something holding in that, and I'm not saying it's wrong, and but it's also, it's reductive, and we've lost some essential animate autonomy of the symbol, of the image of what happened. And yeah, and it's tricky, and I don't know the answer to that, but I think about that all the time with my work.
Yes. And the interesting thing is, it was actually a perfect example in that, although this one ironically has, you know, I'm sure there's still more to unfold, but certainly the kind of realization I had earlier was related to my father. I didn't get there through following that same, like, it's my foot, it's my right, like I'd actually just let go of that. And so it's just like, oh, how beautiful is it that I don't necessarily know this would have arisen if I'd carried on grasping to that's the answer. I think it needed the space it's had for this to almost like come out of nowhere.
And how do you hold the tension, right, between the process of discernment and knowing and kind of chewing on your life that is so important in the work, with the surrender to just like letting it all go and letting something else speak? And that tension it's hard to hold, and it's important to hold.
Yeah. Well, we are up on time. This has been such a enjoyable conversation. Definitely one we could just kept on going with, but we do need to draw it to a close. Thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure. It really has.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to share these ideas.
Yeah, like just so many other things. I'm like, and let's go here, but no, we need to draw it to a close. Where can listeners find out more about you and your wonderful work?
The simplest way would be go to my website, which I'm sure will be included in the podcast notes. It's just ionpsychotherapy.com. Ion is spelled AION. I have my book, other podcasts, my work, how to reach out to me individually, all of that jazz can be found there. So found there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. This has been such a pleasure. Really enjoyed it. Thank you.